All right, so let's get started. So we're going to start with our Google Arts and Culture exhibit called Parading for Progress. So this is an exhibit, I guess that's what Google's calling it, which is, if you look through the document, it is photographs and text and all these text features that we talked about, all that fun stuff. And it is a great resource to learn lots about the different aspects of the women's suffrage movement, how it ties in to women's rights, how it ties into the amendments, including African Americans, the March on Washington, different activists, and then it brings in, of course, like how this connects to current situations too, where we have, if we have our women's rights, this is our women's march. So we had our women's rights march back in 1918, and now, they're, as it says, leaving a legacy. So all of this stuff can be found in the document, and I'm going to read the first few pages of it and then give you guys the link, and I encourage you guys to explore this at the end of the Google Forms. As I showed you earlier, you will see that there are some questions that do correlate to this if you would like to do those like bonus fun activities. So let's get going. Parading for Progress. The 1913 women's suffrage procession through Washington, D.C. completely changed the way protests were viewed and carried out by the American public. Thousands of women took to the streets to fight for their right to vote. Their parade from the U.S. Capitol to the Treasury Building set the precedent for future protest marches. So setting a precedent means setting like basically an example of this is what this happened, so now we're going to reference this for future times. So they marched, so that set a precedent. So now that they marched, we have had marches since then because we were also fighting for this or protesting or using our 5 freedoms, which you all know once again because we all talked about that stuff. So oh yeah, you guys are rock stars. The 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C., unprecedented in both its scales and its tactics. That means that before then, there wasn't a precedent. Since then, now there has been a precedent. And its tactics was a major turning point for the women's suffrage movement in the United States. Suffrage leader Alice Paul, who recently elected head of National American Women's Suffrage Association's Congressional Committee, devised the idea from the large-scale public demonstrations. Paul, who had spent time in England, witnessed more militant tactics than the British suffragists used to draw to their causes. Applying what she had learned in England, Paul decided a massive parade perfectly timed with the President-elect Woodrow Wilson's inauguration would capitalize on the thousands of people gathered in the city. From Seneca to Washington. During the mid-1800s, female abolitionists began drawing parallels between the conditions of the enslaved population and their own condition as pioneers within a patriarchal society. Drawing on this sentiment, women's rights activist Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucy Mott organized a convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, during which they advocated for the female suffrage. The Seneca Falls Convention is recognized as the beginning of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. So, if you've ever heard of smashing the patriarchy, that comes from the idea of a patriarchal society and wanting to like smash it. This is not what these women were doing. They were just living in a patriarchal society and they wanted to change that. So they decided to march on the patriarchy.